Welcome to Larry's Library. If you've never been here before, normally on a Monday, I do a review of a book I read, usually a comic book, collected edition, a graphic novel, an omnibus, whatever you want to term them. But this week, I'm doing a little bit of a special. I'm going to take a look at the ages of comic books. And what I mean by that is Silver Age, Golden Age, etc. And what those mean to me and kind of where they're placed as far as years. And I'll point out a few things that I think are significant, things that I think of about comic books, the ages themselves, and sometimes a little personal bits. So there are two comics that are usually believed to be the first printed U.S. comic books. And that would be The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, which was in 1842, believe it or not, and a comic about the gold rush called Journey to the Gold Diggins by Jeremiah Saddlebags. Now, that's not who wrote it, that's the title. And that was in 1849, a few years later. Now, that one, I think, was an American comic book and in English originally, and whereas that first one was, I think, French and then translated and printed here. Not sure, but I think that's what it said. So you had these very, very early ages that sometimes get referenced that those books would be in. The Pioneer Age, the Victorian Age, and the Platinum Age. I think those are probably platinum. Now, none of that is really important to me, and it's probably not too important to you, because I don't read stuff like that, even if I could get a hold of copies of it. It just, not my thing. So we'll move on to what I consider the good stuff. So the Golden Age is usually mapped as 1938 to 1955, or so. Now, there are a lot of discussion about the end date and the beginning date of the different ages, and some of them overlap with one another. And it just bothers me when they overlap like that. So I usually, on my chart I'll put up here, I kind of have them normally end on a year and then to begin on the next year. Now, I didn't do that on the last age, the modern age, between bronze and modern, but we'll get into that when we get down there. So, the Golden Age. Like I said, 1938 to 1955. Now, I've read a little bit of that. I've got a few collected editions from that period, and it's just not really my thing. It's a little stodgy and pretty corny. I mean, if you think Stan Lee's corny, the stuff from here is even cornier. Of course, he did actually write in that era, so I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? But anyway, I'll point out a few significant things from that era. In 1954, the Comics Code Authority began. Now, that's that little stamp thing that you see up in the corners of all the older comic books and virtually none of the comic books printed today or in recent years. And, that thing tried to say, what you could have as far as violence and sex and nudity and even so much as they would say stuff like, well, you can't have a werewolf or you can't have a vampire, just some arbitrary stuff. And then later they would throw it out or they would ignore it in certain circumstances. And it was just arbitrary and it was just silly and it was just dumb, like most censorship is, and that was comic book censorship for sure. The same year, in 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham published his Seduction of the Innocent book. And that's probably kind of what started the ball rolling with the CCA. And in that book, he claimed that comic books caused juvenile delinquency and just all manner of social ills. He just blamed on comic books. It was crazy. And that book has been widely discredited years later, as just poorly researched and executed and just a bunch of bullshit, basically. A bunch of bullshit to get people up in arms about something that was pretty harmless, Now, moving on to the Silver Age, not much of the Golden Age really interests me, by the way. Like I said, I have a few, collected editions from them, but it's just not my bag. Now, moving on to the Silver Age, that was more or less 1956 through 1969. Yeah, things that are significant for me from there, well, there's a lot. Fantastic Four began in 1961 with the first issue of that, and that began the Marvel Universe as we know it. So that was pretty awesome. I mean, to me, that was the beginning of comic books that I care about, And of course, Amazing Fantasy number 15 was the first Spider-Man appearance and that was in 1962, the year right after that. Now, I'm not going to claim to have every significant thing from these different years. That would be a much longer video and much beyond the scope of what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to point out a few things that I think about when I think of these ages. Now we get into one of my all-time favorite eras of comic books, if not my favorite era. I don't know. It's a real toss-up for me between the Bronze Age and the Modern Age. And, of course, there's a lot of overlap there, and I'll get into a lot of that. Like, for instance, the Bronze Age is usually said to have occurred between 1970, some people say 69, 1970, and 1985. Now, other charts you'll look at and other things you can reference will say it ended in 1980 or in 1979 even, making it a very short era, 9-10 years. So that seems off. So on this chart I just put 1970 and 1985. So it will in fact overlap with the modern age. But at any rate, in 1970, the first Overstreet comic book price guide is published. And so that was pretty significant. In 1976, my first comic book that I ever read, from memory anyway, I remember buying Commandy issue 39, because I remember the Joe Kubert cover with the, he's behind like an aquarium thing, but he's the pet, he's the animal, and then there's some wildlife that are, anthropomorphic. They have him caged in there. I remember that cover. And I bought that or rather my dad bought it for me probably at a bait shop at a fishing lake that we went to. Now, I wasn't much for fishing, but my dad was, at least at one time. And, we walked up there to get some bait, and they had a spinner rack. And, I had no interest in fishing. I really didn't. But I went on the trip with him, and, I said, well, I want to get this comic book. And he's like, go ahead, So got the comic book, put it up there, paid for that and the worms, and we left. And my mind was blown. Jack Kirby, Commandy, all of these animals that could talk, this was like Planet of the Apes, but amped up to, 11. Yeah. And so that, I remember that starting a journey that never ended for me, it still hasn't. But anyway, so that's one of my earliest memories of comic books. And I don't really know which was first. Another one I have is of my Aunt Dee taking me to this little junk shop. I don't know what you would call it. It was almost like a little flea market, but it was just a little store. And they sold just used junk mainly. I mean, they had radios and things. And I remember it being called Pyramid Electronics. Or at least that's what was on the glass. It was painted on the glass. I have no idea, but I guess they repaired radios, but they also sold all kinds of junk and stuff. And among them was some comic book boxes of comics and old magazines and paperback novels and things. And I remember it was either a 10 or a 20 cent box, 10 or 20 cents a piece. Might have been 10 cents because I think the covers were only like 25 or 30 cents then, and these were used. These weren't brand new books. And among them were some issues of Werewolf by Night. And my aunt told me, well, just pick out any 10 you want and I'll get them for you. I'm like, okay. So I picked out 10 of these, and a bunch of them were Werewolf by Night, and there was some other Marvel comics there. And that was probably my first exposure to Marvel. Now, I don't know if the bait shop story is before that or the same year. It's got to be close. I really don't know. But anyway, so my first exposure to comics took place in the Bronze Age. And, if that was 1976, then I was born in 68, so I was pretty young. Now, it's been said that the Copper Age is between 1984 and 1991. So that the Copper Age is inside of the Bronze Age. Well, but then continues on in the Modern Age. So I don't know. I don't know if that is a thing. I don't think it ever really caught on. I mean, I don't see many people reference the Copper Age, so I don't even put it on my list here. But so what you usually find when you look into the comic book years is they list the Modern Age as 1980 to the present. And that's it. I mean, they've been saying that since 1980. The Modern Age is 1980 to the present. So I guess we're never going to have any more ages or eras. Kind of weird. Kind of weird that you would have that all these other eras are much shorter, and then this one is just for the duration. Just on and on. Probably as far as number of comic books and titles and things, this era probably has the most significance for me. Probably mainly because of my age. But I'm not sure that's really true, because a lot of the things I enjoy and I like music, for example. I'm a huge Doors fan. Well, I'm not old enough to be a Doors fan that was introduced to the Doors when they were alive. I discovered them, decades after they were dead and gone, or at least Jim was. So I don't know. I kind of think that even if I was born later, I might still prefer the 80s era as far as comic books, late 70s up through like 1985. Just a ton of really great stuff in my view. And I'll talk about a few of them. 1982, Destroyer Duck #1 was published. And that was, the whole creators' rights thing was raging then, with Steve Gerber and his battle with Marvel, trying to secure rights to Howard the Duck. Spoiler alert, he didn't get them. Sadly, he did not get that. But the Destroyer Duck thing was a lawsuit benefit edition published by Eclipse. And Jack Kirby drew a lot of them. He drew the cover, and Alfredo Alcala and some other people were involved, and it was just a great little book. Yeah, I think it ran for 5 or 6 issues, and the money went to help Steve Gerber's legal defense fund for his trying to secure the rights back from Destroyer Duck. And of course, Jack Kirby had a real beef, and a lot of other people did too. And Neil Adams was a big creator rights guy back then and beyond. So that was pretty significant. Also in the same year, 1982, the Marvel Contest of Champions was published. That was significant to me because that was the first of the company-wide crossover events, really. That started that whole trend. I'm not sure that's good or bad. Probably bad in many ways, but anyway, that happened that year. Also in the same year, Diamond Comics Distribution started their deal, and they got their kind of lock on distributing comic books. That began in 1982. 1982 was a lot of milestones in that year. Another one was the Marvel graphic novel line begins with Jim Starlin's The Death of Captain Marvel. So that was pretty unusual for Marvel because, and really I guess for the industry, because comic books were serialized in singles and then collected. Maybe. Collections didn't get really big until a little further into the 80s and into the 90s. Trade paperback kind of blossomed there, I guess. But so these books were original OGNs, original graphic novels. They were written and drawn for that format. So that was also 1982. In 1985, the speculator boom began. And I don't think I was aware of it, really, that it did. But because when I think of the speculator boom, I think of the 90s. I think of all that awful stuff that happened in the 90s. But really, it started in 85. I think it probably didn't really pick up a lot of steam until the early 90s. But yeah, that began in 85. In the late 1980s, I quit collecting and reading comics like some kind of idiot. I don't know why I did that. I guess I thought I needed to move on, or maybe I thought I was too old or something, I mean, just dumb decision. I've since reobtained almost everything I had in my old collection and more, But yeah, that was something that I should have never done. But anyway, then in 1992, Image Comics began. So that was a big deal. In 1994, Jack Kirby died. He was 76 years old. So that's when we lost him. In 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy protection. So that was right at the heart of the speculator boom. And during that time, all these people came into the hobby, not because they loved the art or they wanted to read the comic books, but because they thought they could make a buck. And I think that was a terrible time for comic books. And I largely skipped all that, as far as being in it during when all that stuff happened. Of course, I've since heard about it. I mean, you heard about it anyway. Heck, it was on TV. I mean, but by 1997, the speculator boom ended. And it ended in a bad way. The house of cards fell apart. And it just couldn't sustain itself. You had copies of X-Force 1. I mean, they still litter the comic book stores. My buddy Matt Hawes had a whole wall in his shop for years that was just plastered with copies of X-Force 1 from the, the 90s X-Force 1. Just shitloads of them. I mean, he had so many, he could literally use it as wallpaper because they were worthless. They were overprinted to the point where they were worth nothing. Yeah. And that's what you had. You had books that didn't deserve the print runs they got, and they got them because of the speculation. That whole market where people rushed in and treated comic books like friggin' baseball cards or something, that you would... and that's part of my whole beef with the CGC, is that mentality that fueled the speculator boom in the 90s. They became a bust. And you had just, I don't know how many, but a lot of comic book shops across the country failed when the boom became a bust, because they no longer had that influx of outsiders coming in to this thing we love, not because they loved the medium, but because they thought they could make money off of it, So that was a sad time, and it almost took Marvel with it, with the bankruptcy and all. Of course, not buying comics during that period, for a long time, for years, I dismissed the whole period as, just a bunch of stuff that I wasn't, I didn't miss anything is what I thought I had in my head. But of course, there were a lot of great comic books made in the 90s, and I've been running scans all through this, and I'm still doing that, of some books that, did deserve the print run they got and probably deserved beyond that. So there were, of course, great stuff. There's been great stuff in all eras of comic books. You just have to look for it. Kind of like music, for pop music, there's some eras are better than others, but there's good stuff. You just have to look for it in all of them. So that, so I didn't want anyone to think that the scans I'm running through here necessarily match what I'm saying as far as talking about a book that maybe didn't deserve its print run. None of these books fall into that for me. So now in the 2000s, in the year 2000 exactly, I returned to reading collected comic books. Well, not just collected books, but just comics in general. I returned to reading and collecting comic books, in a big way around the year 2000. I've relayed the story before. Kristen was in the hospital. Her appendix had burst, and it was bad. She almost died. She was in there a long time, and a lot of times we were just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, and it was just, so I went to a comic book store, and I bought a trade paperback of the Dark Phoenix saga, and I read that during some of that time where I was just stuck in the hospital, and Kristen was just, sleeping mostly, and that got me back in. Thankfully, she was okay. After a lot of cleanup, a lot of surgery to clean that mess up, she was fine, but it was bad for a while. In 2001. Marvel abandoned the Comics Code Authority. They stopped putting the little stamp in the corner. I mean, they had largely ignored it like most people had for a long time. So it was just really a formality of just getting rid of it. And they did. And they were the first big publisher to do that. 2005, Marvel prints their first omnibus. It was the Fantastic Four Volume 1. It reprinted Fantastic Four 1 through 30. Now, they had done some big collections before that some maybe would call an omnibus. But that was the first really official Marvel omnibus came out that year. In 2008, the Marvel Cinematic Universe begins with Iron Man, the first Iron Man, the best one, in my opinion. And that started this awesome train we're on now, In 2009, Disney buys Marvel. A lot of people were worried about that, wondered if they were going to get too involved and they were going to screw up the publishing end. So, in 2011, DC abandoned the Comics Code Authority, and they stopped putting the little stamp on there. So it took them a full, 10 years to catch up with Marvel on that. I'm not sure why, but that's when they did it. And then sadly, in 2018, Stan Lee dies. He was 95 years old. In 2020, Diamond loses their direct market monopoly on comic book distribution, as the people that own DCBS and InStockTrades.com, they formed Lunar, I don't know, distribution, and they ended this decades and decades long lock that Diamond had on comic book distribution. Some people look at that as a good thing, and some not so good thing, because Diamond, you got to give them one thing: they know how to pack their shit. It was unusual to hear anyone complain of getting stuff from Diamond that was messed up. Now, you don't hear about IST to mess anything up either. So you got a good company to do that sort of thing, at least the owner of that company. So I don't know. There's good and bad to things, but generally speaking, monopolies are bad. So maybe it was time for that to end. Maybe it was past time. And that kind of, pretty much brings us up pretty close to today. I mean, that happened, I guess, during all this pandemic stuff, and nobody knew what was going to happen, but it looks like we're coming through it. But anyway, so yeah, we're in the modern age. It began roughly in 1980 and just continues. Anyway, that's what it looks like. And if you take a look here, you can see there's my little chart here, which, again, I'm not saying I'm the be-all and end-all of this information, because I fiddled with the starting and end dates on a few of these to make more sense for me. But yeah, so some of that is debatable and argued about still to this day, and probably will continue to do that. But anyway, if you didn't have any idea about these eras, maybe I'll give you a little bit of an overview on that. I'm not sure which book I'll review next week, but I will be back next Monday, and I'll have something for you, and it'll be good, because I don't really review the bad things. Just the way I roll. This is Larry's library, and if something gets a poor review, boom, it's out of the library. So I don't necessarily need to review it. I want to spread the good stuff. And if you like seeing the good stuff, and you like the way I present my things, the high-res scans and whatnot, please subscribe. Love to have you come back for more, and give me a like if you like this sort of thing, and you like what you see. Come on back next Monday for more, and if you subscribe, you won't miss the other little extras I have, hauls and unboxings and whatnot. So I'll see you. Come on back.